All right, so today, over the next couple videos, we're going to get into some more in-depth lessons for Lincoln Douglas debate. If you are doing like traditional LD and you watched all the videos leading up to this point, you're really pretty set. Obviously, you need to do a lot of practicing and probably more in-depth research on some of these issues on your own. But those are like the big concepts that you need to know in order to actually like go into a debate and kind of know what's going on, right? But if you're doing that circuit debate, or simply you just want to expand your debate knowledge, then there are a lot more different types of arguments that you need to be able to understand, and that can like help you in like more technical rounds. There are going to be three that we're going to cover, which is going to be theory, topicality, and the critique, otherwise known as the K. I do not use these arguments very frequently because I am a traditional debater. So if you are a nat-circuit debater and are watching these, then these are definitely good notes that I pulled from other great nat-circuit debaters. But personally, I don't use these arguments as much, so maybe take the information I give with a grain of salt. This is more of a like basic overview to understand the concepts than a step-by-step guide of exactly how these arguments are going to work and how like they're going to be responded against in every single situation. I simply just can't provide that with my experience levels, but I can definitely give you like the basic overview and a like start on how to start constructing these arguments. So on that note, let's get into the first argument, which is that of theory. So the whole idea behind theory is that there are only so many rules in debate. Largely, as long as you do things such as like follow the speech times, you can do like basically anything you want. There obviously are other restrictions, but it's pretty straightforward. However, people would argue that there are certain like unspoken rules that we have in debate, and if you break those, then you deserve to be punished for them, which is the whole idea of theory. It's an argument that says something that my opponent just did was wrong and it harmed the debate in some way, or maybe even me personally. And as a result, they should face some consequence for it. And it's highly structured to make sure that it can be clear as to what they did wrong, what rule they broke, and how they should be punished as a result. Also, you have to state why the rule should be in place and why it's good for debate, which is like the basic idea. So now let's dive a little bit more in depth as to like the parts of it. So the first thing you have to do is state your interpretation, which is like your rule for debate and how debate should be modeled. You want it to be very specific as to what sides have to do. And like your wording is important. So you should be focusing on what debate should look like, not what it shouldn't look like. You're setting a rule, and you also want it to be good grammar and have good grammar in it and be very precise. So on that rule, like on that note, a good interpretation would be something like all planned inclusive counterplans must be unconditional or dispositional, which is to say that if you're running the specific type of counterplan, you have to stick with it throughout the debate. You can't simply drop it. So like the basic idea behind that is it like very clearly says that it's all counterplans of this type. It's not like specifically this counterplan or the one that my opponent is running. It's just in general. It's in every situation. And the key word generally is must. That's a very good one for allowing you to set a rule that someone has broken, because if it must be done, anything that deviates from it is something that is like breaking that rule. So the wording on it is probably the hardest part of this, because people will use like finicky arguments. And we'll go more into that into the next part, because the next part goes very well with the interpretation. It's the violation, which is just simply stating how they broke the rule you just stated. And you do have to say this no matter how obvious it may seem. And once again, you should be careful with this using very similar words. And why I say similar, a lot of times it's probably best to simply use the exact same word. There's a like famous way to get around theory that is used in the nat circuit. I actually had this ran against me, so I'll provide the example. It was on the nuclear weapons topic. And so someone was running a plan where they said that only the United States and Russia should eliminate nuclear weapons, because technically that is two states it falls under the resolution because that is states as the resolution states. But I was like, no, you have to. I was like, interpretation. The affirmative side must. I don't remember exactly what I said. The affirmative side must protect removing nuclear weapons for all nine nuclear armed nations. And then I said, like, violation, my opponent only protects removing nuclear weapons in 2 states. And then she was like, oh, well, the difference between states and nations, so I do protect it under all nations, but only 2 states, which is like hard to explain if you don't actually like haven't ran theory before. But it just goes to show that like in that ran in the round, like they were able to continue with that argument. So like if you don't have these very specific wordings, people are going to run like really abusive arguments against you, sure, but it's something that will pass in that circuit. You should definitely like watch a bunch of examples of theory and see how they word their interpretation and how it relates to the violation, because that's something where examples are by far the most important thing that you can use, and I unfortunately only have so many of those. But moving on to the next part, whenever you are done with your violation, you have your standards. And this is essentially like your reasons for why what the person has done is bad and why your specific rule is good. So there are a lot of different reasonings behind this. We'll just go through a couple. The first is time skew, which is essentially to say that you're saying that your opponent's argument is set up in a way that you have to spend so much time on their argument, which means you have less time for other stuff. So, for instance, counter plans are generally something that can be a time skew, because if someone runs a bunch of different counter plans and then the affirmative side has to respond to them all in the next speech, they're going to have to like really split their time against a bunch of different arguments. And then next speech, the negative side can just drop all of them and go for like one argument, which unfortunately the affirmative side couldn't put a whole bunch of like responses on because they simply didn't have the time. That'd be an example of like a place where you could use theory to say there's a time skew. We have a general idea, which is that there's like unequal access to the ballot. So, for instance, if you're doing something that one side can do and the other side can't, then obviously like the different arguments on the affirmative and negative and what's available to them is going to be somewhat abusive. This is once again something that's generally levied at the negative side, because the negative side has a lot more things they can do, because anything that they argue for, as long as it's not affirming the resolution, is fine. And they can even like do some of the things of the resolution as long as they don't do everything. So obviously that's where that generally pops up. There's also specificity, which is that the argument is super specific and narrow, that one person can't really respond to it. So like the more specific you get, the less likely someone is going to have like actual evidence against that or research or anything they can use to refute it. So that's where those issues pop up. There's also clash, which is whenever your opponent presents an argument that is so similar to your own that they can't really go against each other. Because obviously the whole point of the debate is to like have clash against like diverse arguments. We're almost to the end of the list here. Limits, which is essentially you have too many positions. Red, there's nothing more to say about that. Only read so many positions. Ground, which is if an argument like limits your quality of responses. So this would be like, once again, stealing half of the affirmative plan and then like not doing the other half and adding something else of your own. And the issue there is that it limits what the affirmatives can say, because if they say they can only attack like one half of that plan, because if they attack the part that is the same as their own, then they're harming themselves. So that'd be an example of like grounding, because there's only so many arguments you can make. It's really limiting the actual like quality of responses. And then after that, you get into voters, which is just like things that are important to us as debaters that are harmed by these like violations. So these are generally like bigger issues, such as like fairness and education and skill. All these things that are like the point of debate is to get better at like debating and speaking, or to have fun. So like obviously if it's not fair, then people aren't having fun, or it's to better educate ourselves and encourage like research, or all of these different things. That is just going to make it to where we're not going to be like having the purpose of debate. those would be your voters. So it'd be simply like you'd say like, oh, they're harming education. Um, and then at the end, you have your basically your punishment. It's called the implication, which is what the judge should do. And there's two different things that you can do. They're called drop the debater and drop the argument, which is essentially to say that you can either argue that your opponent should lose the specific argument that they're running. So if it's a like abusive counterclaim that they shouldn't have that, that's drop the argument. And then there's drop the debater, which is to say they should lose the round for this reason. Like obviously we're going to finish the round, but they should not win because they're breaking the rules too much. Those would be like basically the only two types of punishments that a person can do. So those are like the basic parts to it. There's definitely like those are all that you have to give, but perfecting theory is something that takes a lot of time and practice. Like I said, the best thing you can do right now is to go and look at examples because there's only so much you can do just from hearing the words. You have to kind of see them put into use. And with all the different standards and voters, it's great to go and actually see how they're actually used in a round. So that's like our constructing theory, but also we have to know how to answer it. And there are similarly several parts to answering theory. There are 4 of them. So we'll just go step by step and see what you can do. There is an I meet statement, which is essentially saying that, yeah, I followed your rule. This is where a lot of like weird things with the violation can pop up because like if you say that interpretation, the affirmative plan must like, so for instance on the next one where it's lethal autonomous weapons, if the affirmative plan is only like removing it and banning it in 2 states, then you could be like interpretation. The affirmative side has to protect banning lethal autonomous weapons in all nations. Violation, they only protect removing them in 2. Then someone could literally come up and say, there are only 2 nations in the world. And if that's true, which obviously it's not, but then they can like argue that it's like, oh, well, we're meeting the rule because there are only 2 nations. So if I'm like supporting removing them in 2, then I'm supporting removing them in all. And once again, that's a real argument that people use. So that's what the I meet is. And obviously, a lot of times it's less semantics and it's simply, yeah, I did follow your rule and here's why. So that one is like the best you could do because it just completely like destroys their argument if you win. The next one is the counter interpretation, which is essentially like you providing a different rule that is better than what your opponent's. This is going to obviously defend what you're being accused of. And obviously, like you should meet your counter interpretation. That should be the first thing. But similarly to how we wanted to focus on like must and specific wordings in the interpretation, this one's going to be having very specific wordings as well with generally may, because obviously we are not going to be forcing people to do like whatever type of advocacy you have, but you're saying that you should have the right to. And it should also like achieve some of the offense of the other side's interpretation, because if they're arguing that like they're helping to protect education, then like your rule should help protect education as well. Then beyond that, we have standards and offense, which is like defense against their specific standard for your counter interpretation. So you could talk about how, like, for instance, saying that their interpretation is too limiting because we're just going to have the same debate over and over again because you're saying I can only run like these specific arguments. This is just you're once again saying like giving that rule is making the debate unfair to me. You could also do regress or arbitrariness, which is like when it's super specific to you, because then you're just like, this isn't a rule or a norm for debate. You're just like destroying it. You're coming directly at me. You can also say that it's harmful for education under this because like running theory inherently is bad, because then you're not actually like discussing, you're just always going to run theory and win on that. So it's like, that's obviously not actually furthering education or really debate as a whole. So you could like just run that against theory as a whole. And then lastly, you have paradigm issues, which is like either side can do this, but it's mainly on the like answering theory side. and it's how you evaluate theory debates. So you have like your competing interpretations versus actual reasonability. So if you have competing interpretations, you should try and decide like the winner of the theory debate based off the person with the best interpretation. And so in the paradigm issues, you're trying to prove that your rule is the most fair. It has the like most reasonability. So you're going to argue like as the counter interpretation that good is good enough. You don't have to be perfect. So the person responding wins the theory debate if their counter interpretation is reasonable. They don't necessarily have to have it like perfect or have the best one, but if it's good enough and it's not limiting, they should win. Um, Otherwise, the only other thing you really have beyond that is a reverse voting issue. Which is essentially saying that like because there's such a time skew from this whole theory debate, the person responding to theory should win the whole debate if they win theory. That's the only thing which kind of like goes with paradigm issues. So we were definitely like a lot less in depth on answering theory because generally you need to like actually be able to go in and make your normal interpretations first because answering theory is a lot just like normal theory again, but doing it to protect yourself instead of attacking your opponent. But even in some cases, it's still going to be attacking your opponent as shown by things like the reverse voting issues in our offense. But that is all we really have. Otherwise, you can obviously extend theory, which is just in your next speech, extending your interpretation violation and explaining and kind of going against what your opponent just said. But this just kind of goes back to like the basics of debate. So there's not really too much more to say there. But yeah, that's the basic idea behind theory. Out of like all of the like special arguments that we're going to go over in the next couple videos, this one is probably the one I'd say is the most common in that circuit. Like I saw it ran the most, and it's also probably one of the simplest. Like this was the one I was definitely most comfortable with running, but also it's pretty like I just personally found that it wasn't the hardest thing ever. But otherwise there's not too much to say, so I hope that as always this video was educational.